next time.
Inshallah.
We're live. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of the Growth Mindset podcast, brought to you by IEC Husaini. We are your hosts. One of us keeps getting blurred because of the virtual background. So bear with us. I am Sean Abbas, and this is...
I'm Muhammad Raza, and today we're here with Sayyid Bilal Rizvi, continuing our discussion on growth mindset. So Sayyid Bilal, would you like to first introduce the specific topic for today, and also talk a little bit about how this overall connects to this theme that we have for this podcast series?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I give everyone my condolences. Later this evening is the Shahadat of Imam Muhammad al-Jawad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Any blessing or goodness we have in our lives is because of the sacrifice of the Aimma of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So that occasion should not be forgotten and its importance should be given. So as for today's topic, the title was a little bit more complex, and we titled it what? It was an introduction to epistemology.
Yeah.
Is science the only verifiable knowledge? So it's a little bit of a mouthful. So I'll go and kind of explain, what exactly that means. So the series has been growth mindset. And as we discussed last time in our introductory podcast, to have this positive growing mindset, we need to establish a worldview. How do we view the world around us? And eventually, how does this lead to us interacting with the world around us? Because the way we interact with the world is dependent upon how we view the world. Now, when we come to viewing the world, a key component of forming a worldview is to have an understanding of knowledge. That what is knowledge, what is true knowledge, what is verifiable knowledge, because this will lead us to view the world around us. So I'll give you one example. If we believe that the only verifiable true knowledge is that knowledge which is acquired via the 5 senses, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, then anything outside of the realm of empiricism and these senses is not something which is verifiable. At that point, you can say that morality is something which is relative. It cannot objectively be proven, and it has an impact in our action and how we deal with the society around us. If we say that God is not a sensual being via the 5 senses, then we can't attain a spiritual state of yaqeen, because we established with this supposed view that the only verifiable knowledge is via the 5 senses. So, how we view knowledge, how we understand knowledge has a profound impact in every aspect of our lives. And this is something that Muslim scholars, they recognize the importance of this subject, particularly in the 20th century. Because in the 20th century, there was many different groups with their own worldviews, such as Marxism, socialism, and each of them, they were based on their own backdrop. For example, if you had a relativistic worldview, meaning that you believed that the only object of knowledge is our own thoughts and not the outside world, at that point, it has an impact on you. So epistemology really began to be discussed, that what is true, what is false, how do you determine if something is true, how do you determine if something is false, what are the different mechanisms to acquire knowledge? And once we understood these different mechanisms to acquire knowledge, how do we hone them within us in order that we can actualize our potential? And I don't want to long introduction, because it really is a very complex and deep subject. And
the topic of epistemology, people get their PhDs. So today I don't think in an hour we can even scratch the surface. Really, we're just looking at the surface.
Yeah. In many ways, what we can do is try to give some direction in terms of where best to learn more about these topics as well, which we can probably do at the end of the talk.
Absolutely.
But I'd like to first start off, which is really interesting, is all three of us have a science background. In general, we've all studied natural sciences. So I want to take a moment and see if Sean, you can introduce yourself in terms of what your background is, also Saidbal, and then I'll go, and then we can kind of talk about our individual experiences with natural sciences and really what shortcomings that we've seen in that in terms of gaining knowledge.
Actually, before we do that, I kind of wanted us to be precise with our terms, because I think it's useful that we understand what we mean by the word science. Because the word science really has carried two definitions in the history of thought. The first definition, which most of us are accustomed to in the modern world, is the mathematical, natural, modern sciences, whereas the word science in and of itself was synonymous with the word ilm, and knowledge in the traditional sense. So science was equivalent to the word episteme, which meant knowledge related to epistemology, and what we understand as the word ilm. So I thought, that's a important side point, because a lot of different discussions and nuances can be taken from that point. But I'll let you guys continue with the point you were making.
Well, before we get into that, just a reminder to all our viewers out there, you can use the live chat to put in comments and questions. To those of you who are viewing this afterwards, you can still put in comments. We will address them in our next podcast, which will be in 2 weeks for episode 3. So any feedback, any comments, any questions, put them in there. You can also use hashtag IEC podcast or hashtag IEC growth mindset on any other social media platform, and we'll pick it up. You can either do that to promote the podcast, or let us know, give us feedback, or if you have any questions, send it our way. Sayyid Bilal will help answer them, and Muhammad Ali and myself can chime in as well. So we'd like to hear from the viewers as well. But yeah, so going back to the topic, getting into our background a little bit. My background is in chemistry, so I've worked as a chemist for multiple years, mainly on the formulation aspect of it, but did a little bit on the analytical side, and a lot of it revolves around actually looking at measurable quantities. And so, going back to your definition of epistemology, and for the viewers out there, please don't get scared away by such big words as epistemology. Hopefully we'll be able to answer these questions on what it is exactly.
The study of knowledge.
The study of knowledge.
The study of knowledge, yeah.
But so one thing that I've noticed, and throughout my experience, is in most scientific fields, we're looking for measurable data, and we're looking to prove a point. There's a such thing as a null hypothesis, where basically where the study that we've done has failed, but using that data is helpful to get new data, or
to draw a conclusion.
Correct, or to create a new experiment. And so what happens is that the value of that is very high. However, in most scientific fields, it doesn't mean anything, or it doesn't have the same value. So that knowledge that is there is being missed out in a lot of scientific fields. I'm not trying to say anything against what most fields do, but when it comes down to it, everyone is trying to prove a point, to come to a conclusion that is measurable and is verifiable, and then also it comes down to funding. A university, for instance, isn't going to spend $2 million over the course of a year to find nothing. In that case, they will not fund that professor again if they keep finding this professor finds nothing every time. But that nothing that was found is helpful in the entirety of gathering knowledge. But in most sciences, it has very, very little value.
Yeah, I'd like to add, one of the problems with science these days, though, look, science has, as someone I've 3 different engineering degrees, biomedical engineering, electrical engineering, and a master's as well. I know that, I've taken a plethora of science classes, and I've always been more inclined towards the sciences, natural sciences themselves. So definitely you can say I have I have a love and an interest towards it. And deep down, I think true science, actually, the pursuit of nature and stuff like that is highly discussed upon in the Quran by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, he oftentimes refers to those who reflect, or those who look at his signs, and his signs are in many ways science is the study of his signs, in many ways. So I do believe that it is science in its actuality, in its essence, is a divine thing. But oftentimes what we see in there's two issues here though. Oftentimes science as we know it right now had the intentions are very different. It's not oftentimes for the pursuit of knowledge, like Sean was just mentioning. Oftentimes there's interest funding certain sciences. If you're trying to answer a certain question that's backing some sort of monetary interest, then there's going to be money towards that particular question. You can't just go out and ask and answer all the questions that you're capable of asking. You're usually left to those that you're going to, you receive funding for. And the other thing is you're oftentimes forced to produce results. If someone is seeking out a PhD, they have to come out with something novel. They have to come out with something that's unique and new, and they're forced to discover something oftentimes. And they're left in a situation where, sometimes as a data scientist myself, I know it's very easy to manipulate data in such a way that one thing could show something one way, and it could show a completely different thing another way. So it's important to recognize these things. And the second thing is the limitations of our senses, and what is actual essence of knowledge or understanding. Science might give, if you really boil it down, you can't really understand anything through scientific experimentation. Understanding is something that comes maybe more indirectly, if that. It's something that comes through experience. It's something that comes through, give me an example. How do you scientifically, let's look at a few things that we believe do exist universally. A lot of people believe this concept of love exists universally, right? And it's very hard to deny that it doesn't. But how do you quantify that? How do you use your five senses to explain that? How do you, so there's many things that science, in fact, not just many things, but the most important realities, science really, at least what we know is doesn't really.
I'm going to actually take a very different route than what both of you took. I mean,
sure.
I have background in the modern sciences as well. Before I took on Islamic studies and went to Najaf, I did my BA in biology, then I did a master's in the medical sciences actually in Chicago. But I just think that this whole notion and this whole line we've made into a cliche that there is no contradiction between science and religion. And what that really means is there is no contradiction between religion and science in the original sense of the word, but there is a contradiction between modern science and the religious principles that we stand for. And I'm very open and very blunt, about saying this. One of the goals of this podcast was to speak openly, so I will speak openly about that. Islam denies this type of view that when it comes to the study of science, an atheist who is a scientist and a Muslim or a believer who is a scientist are exactly upon the same level. Because why are you pursuing that science? If there's no goal behind that science, you don't have a purpose driving. And I think this is the point that Shah Abbas was alluding to, that many times in highly specialized scientific fields, there are discoveries made, there's quantitative analysis being made, but at the end of the day, what's the goal? That knowledge is not being passed down. It's not being used towards something more productive. But when it comes to the traditional scientific worldview that Muslim scientists and Muslim scholars have held for thousands of years, many of these crises that we see in the modern world from the study of science, they didn't exist in the Muslim world. Nobody was becoming an atheist because they would study science. That's something which we see in the modern world. So this goes to show that science in the modern understanding, there is something which is fundamentally wrong with it. And there's many scholars who've openly spoken out about this, whether in the Western academy, whether in the traditional Islamic world. And a lot of these ideas and these issues come from the fact that there is no purpose behind it. Whereas within the Muslim world, when it came to science, right, there was a division basically in the traditional philosophical understanding of the world. In the Muslim world, physics was understood to be the study of change and the study of the physical world. And under physics, we had all of these different modern sciences, chemistry, physics in the modern sense, biology, all of these different sciences. So we find that the goal of the Muslim scientists for thousands of years was that this pursuit is to understand the creation of God. And this is a point that Muhammad Ali had made, that when you understand the system of God, it's actually a very spiritual exercise. I mean, somebody like Nasiruddin At-Tusi was not having a spiritual crisis by studying science. I mean, if you look at Tusi's accomplishments, they're quite, overwhelming to even speak about, trigonometry, coming up with the, 6 famous functions, writing a commentary on the Almagest of Ptolemy, writing a commentary on the elements of Euclid, astrology, astronomy, so many different subjects. But at the same time, Tusi was a jurist. Tusi wrote one of the most famous theological works known as the Tajrid al-I'tiqad, which is still studied in the different hawzat and centers of traditional Islamic learning. So this crisis, it didn't really exist. So the goal of this podcast, right, and the goal that really this discussion is trying to convey is that how do we step out of this preconditioned, this, societally conditioned notion that modern science is the greatest achievement and the greatest ilm a person can gain. And whether you like it or not, this is something that seeps in our communities as well. If somebody is a doctor or an engineer, which is a great accomplishment, and we need doctors, we need engineers, but you find that's something which is given the highest honor, that even when it comes to the social status behind marriage, oh, he's a doctor, he's an engineer, you can't turn that person down without looking at the other facets of that person's life. But there are other areas that contribute to your understanding of the world holistically. And oftentimes, if somebody pursues those different fields, our communities, ourselves, we look down upon those individuals. And this is an indirect worship of modern science. And there's, I'm speaking very bluntly, that's what it's come down to. So I think I'll leave it at these different points. We can get into a little bit nuanced discussions. I'll let you guys, give your
I want to hear your thought on this is something that I had a discussion with one of my Ahl Sunnah friends, not too long ago. And we see all these articles. I mean, you spend enough time on WhatsApp, you get enough forwards that all these really interesting things. Oh, science just discovered this, Islam said it 1400 years ago. Imam Ali has said this. Now science is just finding this out now.
You'll have a bad day.
Yeah. There's so much information out there, but that's a topic on its own. But you see a lot of people, even people who are very religious, who have a strong faith, they use these as a way to build their faith, which I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that, but the problem is when you make that the only barometer for your faith.
Yeah.
Many of you might have read that book, The Quran, the Bible, and Science by Maurice Bucaille. It's a famous book that many people read, and basically the whole premise of that book is that the Quran is more in line with modern science, so the Quran is the book of God. Now, you really put it into a syllogism, right? It's kind of absurd the way the entire premise of the book lays out. The entire premise comes down to this: modern science is a hujjah and an unarguable evidence. The Quran is in line with modern science. Thus, the Quran is the book of God.
So the science is the Furqan, not the Quran. It's like,
you have elevated that above the Quran. And now I'm not saying that one cannot test the facts within the Quran, or one cannot, test the rational arguments within the Quran. I mean, there rationally a person is able to go towards the belief in Allah and the belief in the Prophet and the necessity of revelation. But there are many facts that can only be understood through revelation. That's why Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam says, Inna deen Allah la yusabu bil uqul naqisa. That the religion of God cannot be understood with deficient intellects. Now, does this mean that rationally with my intellect, I cannot come to the conclusion that God exists? No, absolutely I can. But there are aspects that are veiled from us and we need revelation. For example, when you go and do wudu, one of the goals of wudu is cleanliness. When you wipe your feet, you wipe the top of your feet. Now I ask you, some people can say rationally, the bottom of your foot is touching the ground, and that's what's dirtier. Shouldn't we be wiping the bottom of our foot instead of the top? At the end of the day, there's a level of submission. And this is something I see in different question and answer sessions, why is this halal? Why is this haram? And when I give the answer that it's because God dictated, and this is what we find in the traditions of the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt, that this is, the hukm of Allah on the subject, many people think that that's a very unknowledgeable answer. But the reality is that there is a level of submission, and that level of submission can only come when we recognize that there are different forms of epistemological sources of knowledge. When we understand that there are different ways to acquire knowledge.
That's well spoken. Yeah, and I've noticed this where people, going back, is they're just looking for verification, and they're looking for verification through modern science. And
I mean, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I mean, this phenomenon even became quite popular in the 20th century because there was a form of tafsir known as tafsir ilmi. In other words, a scientific commentary of the Quran. Now, I'm not, vehemently opposed to such tafasir, but they're really quite limited. Because
I think that's the problem.
They're limited, and they've been influenced by a particular worldview that the modern world has pushed upon people. And we've seen it, even many Muslim scholars have fallen into that trap. In Egypt, there was a famous scholar by the name of Taha Hussein. So Taha Hussein, for example, Suratul Fil, and the story that, when the Quran, it speaks about those birds and they would drop stones, for example, when, of course, Abraha and his army went to go and destroy the Kaaba, he said that this in the Quran is symbolism for, smallpox or some form of disease. So you see how far some people
will go to try to validate it through
science in the Muslim world.
There's some interesting aspects to this whole argument. Even atheists have brought up as well, in terms of they looked at certain translations of the Quran pre, for example. One of the things that they talk about in the Quran is that the Quran talks about the expanding and contraction of the universe. And there were some atheists that made these claims of saying, if you look at these translations prior to scientific discovery of the expansion of the universe, the terms were different. They didn't translate into expansion of the universe. And it was just kind of like something that happened in more modern translations, stuff like that. It's not something I've looked into, but, it kind of indicates this type of shift that they're trying to keep Quran in relative to what's going on with the sciences. That said, one of the things is that what you mentioned earlier is that science not having a purpose for modern day science, but for those who are trying to seek understanding of God, science is one of the best, one of the most profound vehicles that they can use. It's filled with abundant science from Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, not just for empirical understanding, but understanding for the inner self as well. Right? There's a lot of these allegories and metaphors of things that are happening in nature that we also notice about our own lives, on relationships that we see with things in nature, and these relationships that are alluded to us and our Creator as well. So there's many things that the science, like I said, is also great for those who are there. Actually, they have a purpose, and that purpose is to better understand God. That's why one of those reasons why I tend to take this counter argument here, saying that yes, the people who have who have studied sciences and stuff like that have been put on a pedestal. I look at it at also there is a deficiency in our you can say our seminaries themselves in terms of pursuing sciences these days as compared to before. So there's been a deep part also. So science itself was a knowledge that was teaching by our Al-Bay. It was something that, but nowadays in modern times, this isn't something that is stressed upon. In fact, other knowledges, for example, knowledge of the laws of Islam, have trumped more than the understanding of, let's say mathematics, the understanding of other scientific fields that were also, taught, in the past. So there, in a way, you can say the modern world has devoted itself to spiritual pursuit. I think
more so a notion of the separatization of different education centers. But I will say that there have been many scholars within the past, more so within the past, that really did take a more holistic view. For example, Allama Tabatabai, if you read his famous biography, which one of his students wrote about him, called Mehr Taban, which in Farsi, and I think it was translated into English with the title called The Shining Sun. Within that autobiography, Allama Tabatabai mentions that when he was in Najaf, one of his teachers advised him to go and study mathematics, because the study of mathematics is very useful in training the mind when it comes to the study of philosophy. And the study of philosophy has been viewed by many scholars. Of course, there's a debate towards philosophy. There's people on both sides. I'm not presenting a unanimous viewpoint. Was viewed as a key element of understanding the world around us. I mean, further than that, in the modern world, we find somebody like Ayatollah Hassan Zada Amuli, who really went into different fields of, geometry, mathematics. So there are fine examples, but I think the solution that we really need to push is that there really needs to be a holistic understanding. And that holistic understanding really can only come forth when there is a focal point in our life. And I kind of mentioned this last time. In other words, we as Muslims, especially in the modern world, we kind of compartmentalize our life. And it sounds a bit strange to say that, but it's kind of like that when I go to the mosque, this is my time to be religious, and this is the time for Islam. And when I'm with my friends, this is my time to chill. And when I'm at school, I have a different personality. So, you go to 5 different places, you have 5 different personalities, you're 5 different individuals. There's no focal point, there's no tawheed, there's no unison. And a person who really is able to have a mindset where they've kind of focused their life on the pursuit of perfection and the pursuit of closeness to God, all of these different, dualities and all of these different, multitudes and multiplicity within themselves, they come towards one goal. So when that happens, no matter what you're doing, whether it's the study of jurisprudence, whether it is to spiritually develop yourself, whether it is going on your academic educational pursuit, you're able to hone in and make it a spiritual exercise.
I that the concept or the point that you're making about us being very compartmentalized, segmented in our own different ways, I think that resonates with a lot, especially people that have grown up here.
It really comes from the fact that deep down we're not comfortable with ourselves. We don't know ourselves, as Imam Ali says, "Man arafa
Subhanallah.
that the one who knows themselves has known their Lord." I mean, we have a tradition that we should really take pride in. I mean, there's been much sacrifice, there's been much benefit that's come, and that's something which is often neglected. It's something which is often forgotten to fit in, or for whatever other reasons as well.
Yeah, I agree. Just to pause for 1 second, everyone that is viewing in, please enter your questions in the live chat, or any comments that you might have. We will address them as they come in. Also, you can tag us on any social media, IEC Podcast, IEC Growth Mindset. Now, I want to, not really shift gears, but just one kind of change here. We're looking at, we've talked about finding science to prove Islam. How people are seeking that. That's part of the discussion we've had. What about the flip of it? Is there a way? Do you think we're able to prove the existence of God through science? Or I know this is a very deep discussion per se, but just touching on the surface, because I've seen a lot within our youth. They're looking for those questions. They're looking for that answer because they're trying to prove to their either non-Muslim friends, atheists, a way to explain it to them. And I feel like it's very difficult to do. It's in general, it's difficult to convince someone who doesn't believe in God that there is a God. But are there ways? And I'm not even talking about specifics, but what would you recommend as methods to try to address those things?
So when it comes to the existence of God, I think it would be appropriate to start with one of the quotes by Allama Tabatabai, which he mentions in a footnote in a commentary that he wrote. He says that every argument, burhan, the word used in Arabic, for the existence of God is but an implication to the most self-evident reality. God is the most evident thing in the universe, that he's not in need of being proven. But with that said, there have been many, arguments that have been given for the existence of God. For example, there is the argument based on contingency and necessity, which just based upon the concept that there is existence, you can go from the concept of existence to the existence of God just by that one fact. So you have a rational method. Many individuals, they pointed towards the harmony of the universe. And when we look in the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, one of the most famous works of hadith that we have is Al-Kafi. And one of the early books in Al-Kafi, one of the first books, is about God and the existence of God. And many of the traditions of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt are there, in which many people who were atheists, who came from different backgrounds, who didn't believe in one God, they would come to the Imams and they would basically ask them that how do we prove this? How do we understand this? And oftentimes the Imams, they would point towards nature. They would point towards the harmony of the universe, which is an allusion towards, the cosmological / teleological, these different arguments. Or for example, if somebody believed in, 2 gods, the Imams would point that, the universe is in harmony, there can't be 2 gods. But of course, many of those people who would come to them were very simplistic in understanding. So the imams would give simplistic answers, whereas in other traditions, they do go into more complexity. So with that said, yes, there is a way, there is a role for science. I'm not denying that even, science in the sense of understanding the world around us, it absolutely has a role, because it's understanding a portion of reality. And that's a very key point that
Can I add one thing? I think just to support what you were saying, the cosmological arguments or the contingency arguments that Sayyid Bilal is referring to, these are logical arguments. These are arguments that are based off of math and logic, that many scientists have used in the past. Mullah Sadr is very famous, Ibn Sina, but also other more modern scientists and stuff, more modern theologians have also talked about these things. So if somebody wants to actually try to prove an argument for God, there are various proofs that are out there that are based off of pure logic, that are based off of that. This is a fallacy to say that this can't be proved through logic. This has been proved through logic.
I think that's a little bit off topic, and it's its own discussion. I know everyone.
I apologize for asking a question that's veering us a little bit off topic, but
yeah. So I think let's save that for its own discussion, because it does deserve that.
Yeah.
But we're at minute 40, right? 40 minutes in.
Yeah.
What do we have? Minutes left? 15-20 minutes left?
Yeah, about 13 minutes.
Okay. Well, basically, I think there's two important things that would be important to discuss. The first thing which is important to discuss is that, how do we refute this idea of scientism? Scientism states that the only verifiable knowledge is through the senses and the scientific method. Everything else is an opinion, or everything else is unverifiable, even if it's true. So how would you refute that is the question. So I think one obvious refutation is that this statement itself can't be proved through the scientific method in the five senses. Mm-hmm. When you say that the only knowledge is that which is acquired via the five senses, then prove this statement to me via the five senses. So this really shows that there is a room for rationality. So when it comes to epistemology, right, and why epistemology is important is when you are training a student, for example, you're going to train that student to develop himself, to complete, that development at a holistic level. And that can only come forth when we recognize what are the different levels of reality. So when it comes to knowledge, there is not just one form of knowledge. We find that, the senses are something which have epistemological position. Then after that, the intellect has a position. But in Islamic thought, even the heart is a tool for acquiring knowledge. And I really wanted to mention that point, because that itself is a very important discussion. And I think many people, especially in the modern world, can benefit from this idea. So, if you look within the Quran in Surah An-Nahl, in chapter 16, verse 78, Allah within this verse says, Wallahu akhrajakum min butuni ummahatikum la ta'lamuna shay'a. That God has brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers while you didn't know anything. Then after that, he says, وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. And he made for you hearing, eyesight, and the heart so that you can give thanks. Now, over here in this verse, it's speaking about knowledge, that your original state was you didn't know anything. Then after that, it mentions three tools of knowledge. It says hearing, sight, and the hearts. And that's one of the beauties of knowledge within the Islamic worldview and the Islamic epistemological worldview, because knowledge is not simply a rational pursuit. Knowledge is not just an exercise of the mind. At the end of the day, I can read 1,000 books, and my memory can be incredible because I went through all of these mental gymnastics, but there's no guarantee that I have ilm. Because when you look at the traditions of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, knowledge is that which is internalized into the spirit. And knowledge is that which is acted upon. And a Muslim who approaches the physical sciences with this type of understanding of what is the true nature of knowledge, you find it will be a much more spiritual exercise than an individual who just performs it for a monetary gain or a funding position or whatever other motivation. That's why when in the beginning of this, of this discussion, I opposed this cliche notion that, science and religion, there's no incompatibility. I believe that modern science and the way that it's used and its applications and what we made it is incompatible. But what we need is to rehone and to remake this understanding.
Right. And I have to say, I love hearing verses from the Quran, but when you say them, it adds another layer of beauty.
After the verses themselves, there's no additional layer of beauty that can be added, but I do appreciate the kind thoughts.
That's what my question, going back to that can we address religion and the existence of God through just science? I had an ulterior motive in that question. I was hoping you would go down this path of just knowing things, the concept of the heart, being able to sense it. And I feel like, and please refute me if you disagree. A lot of people these days, including myself, I have these struggles of the heart, struggles of faith. We all do, ups and downs in our faith, where we're searching. We might just be going through the steps, going back to the growth mindset, the podcast, the whole purpose of this is growth mindset. How do are there methods to translate and get the heart more involved instead of just going through steps of religion, whether that's, praying 5 times, doing our fasts in Ramadan, or even attending majalis, to get our heart back in it or to keep our heart in it? Are there any type of tips?
I mean, so basically, to reword the question, is that how can we spiritually train ourselves so that our heart is lively, in other words? And what we need to realize is that when it comes to spiritual exercise, it requires training, it requires growth, in the way that if you don't use your physical bodies, your body begins to deteriorate. In the same way that, when you've lived a lifestyle of neglecting God, neglecting your responsibilities for 20, 25, 30 years, yes, for some people, one life-changing experience can jolt their heart back to life. But for other people, it requires a process. And this process is going to be difficult in the beginning oftentimes. And that's what the nature of it is. When you go to the gym for the first time after 5 years, after a year, the first few workouts, they aren't easy. You're tired. And that's why it's been recommended by scholars that when you begin this process of spiritually training, don't wear yourself out. Meaning, for example, I'll give you a very practical example. When it comes to the night of Qadr, many people, they think that on the night of Qadr that, I have to recite those 1,000 units of prayer, otherwise God won't accept my du'as. God's much bigger than that. Allah is much more merciful than that. And, the goal isn't just to have a quantitative, checklist of reciting, the 100 units of prayer. But it's really for you to have a moment where your heart is encapsulated in the moment, in the remembrance of God.
Wow.
And that's something which we need to remember, that, the world is kind of, we're having this discussion about science. One of the flaws of the modern world is that we become quantitative and we've really neglected quality. And that's something which we have found within our religion as well. We become quantitative to the neglect of quality oftentimes also. So that's really the first advice that I would give, is that if you really want the heart to reconnect, then have a moment of quality time of remembering God, quality time in your prayer, quality time in dua. It doesn't have to be something extensive, but what you'll find is that the more you enjoy it, the more even the time that you give to it will begin to increase. So that's really the first level. The second, I mean, there's so many different advices that it's really, you know, a deep subject in and of itself, because, you know, you're really asking that how does one spiritually train themselves?
Yeah.
So
I think one advice that I give to myself oftentimes is that try to taste the beauty of that action. For example, let's say if we're talking about a salat, right? The salat itself is, I remember this mother came up to us one time and they were saying that, you know, my son, he oftentimes doesn't read his Fajr Salat, you know, he doesn't wake up and then he goes to school, this and that. What can I do to get him to wake up for Fajr, this and that? And I asked him, okay, you know, if Fajr doesn't take that long, just read it when you do get up first as a first step. Let's say you're already late, it's already Khazar, but make a priority that you're going to read it as opposed to just discard it. And then try to, when you're reading it, take your time and try to learn to enjoy it, savor, find that sweetness of that prayer. And what happens after that is then once you've tasted it or once you've realized it, then what happens is that you'll always try to pursue that, know that this is salat, this is something that I want to achieve. And then you'll strive further in your life to continue to achieve that. That means now reading it on time.
And that push really comes from true knowledge.
Yeah. That's something nobody could teach you. You have to go through the experience.
As Imam Sadiq said, لَيْسَ الْإِلْمُ بِالتَّعَلُّمِ, to, you know, his Unwan al-Basri, that knowledge isn't acquired by learning. You know, and there's another tradition that says that when one doesn't act upon their knowledge, the most minimum punishment that God gives to that person is that he takes away the sweetness of his remembrance from the heart of that person.
Wow.
So, you know, there's many, you know, discussions that revolve around this, but I believe we're coming towards the end of our time.
12 minutes. We're still good. Yeah, about 12 minutes.
Are there any questions that we received? Or that you guys had left on the list to discuss?
Did you see any questions?
There's a question, but it's kind of it's a good question, but it's a little bit of a heavy question. And this comes from Brother Karam Abbas. I think you might know him. Can we gather or gain real knowledge, ilm, like you were talking about? What is the best way to gather that?
Or is it possible to gather that?
True knowledge, in its most complete sense, is gained by a lifelong devotion. And that lifelong devotion involves not only one's own effort, but one's own focus on their spiritual purification. You know, we see in the Quran in Surah Al-Jumu'ah that, you know, when Allah speaks within that verse and he speaks about the sending of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
And he speaks that he was sent towards the people, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة. That he sent towards the people a messenger who would recite to them the signs of God and purify them and teach them the book and wisdom. So when you look at this verse, before ilm and ta'aleem and teaching is mentioned, we find that tazkiyah and self-purification is mentioned. And that shows that, true knowledge comes from ma'rifah. And true knowledge, it comes from acting upon what you know. It comes from self-purification, and it really comes by submitting towards Allah. Because as the tradition, it says that, the one who acts upon what he knows, God will teach him that what he doesn't know. And what this tradition means is that, in both senses, you can know something, right? At the end of the day, if I know that prayer is mandatory, whether I pray or I don't pray, that is a fact that I know. But what this tradition means is that when you act upon that fact becomes a part and parcel of your very being. When it becomes a part and parcel of your very being, all of that impact which is associated with that positive act, it becomes a part and parcel of you. For example, if it's stated about prayer, inna salata tanha anil fahshai wal munkar, that prayer keeps you away from indecencies and immoralities, you find that becomes a very piece of the, core and fiber of your being. So these are,
one thing I want to add to that, I think is really beautiful, is that, the argument can be made that nothing can be learned except through experience. An example of that is, so driving a car, for example. I can't sit here and write down, and I can write down all the instructions on what you're supposed to do to drive a car. I can give you a book, I can give you all the lectures, but until you go through the action of actually doing it, you are not going to learn. And this is just physical stuff, but I'm trying to make the argument that all things are like this. I might have the knowledge of doing something in my heart, right? But I can't give that knowledge to you the same way I can't think about a loaf of bread and make you full by talking about it. You have to go through that action. You have to go through that experience in order to gain that understanding. If that makes any sense. What does it modify for understanding? And could be the understanding of how to drive a car. And really, people use these types of things. But you're saying?
Can I use another example? Mm-hmm. A little bit. Something I was reading the other day. Mm-hmm. I'll say, well, you might find this funny. But so if you look on paper, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Kevin Durant.
I think you butchered the last name, man.
Yeah, so, forgive me, all the Bucks fans out there. They're 0-2 right now, so we'll leave it at that. Maybe by the next podcast they'll win a couple games. But they are the same on paper. They are almost the same height and the same weight. But if you look at them, Giannis is huge, big muscles, bowling ball shoulders, and Kevin Durant is very, very skinny. He looks like he needs to eat a sandwich. But sometimes what the knowledge is, or what the science indicates on paper, what is actually physical, does not really translate to what the reality of the situation is. And that's where there is a completely separate understanding. Obviously the understanding is visual. It's another one of our senses. But it takes another element to get to understanding, two different people.
Yeah.
I think the point you were, I didn't follow, I'll be quite honest, the entire analogy. I respect the effort, but I think the, key point to, kind of summarize and to conclude the discussion is that when it comes to epistemology, one thing to remember is that there are different mediums to acquire knowledge. It's not limited to just the five senses. And, we need to remember that and to keep that in our mind. And, I think any further discussions are outside of the scope of a 1-hour podcast.
Yeah. Right. Before we wrap up, can you discuss a little bit about the next topic, and how it's going to tie in, or in just for our listeners, just to give an understanding of, and also some of the other topics that are going to be coming up?
So for the next topic, what I really wanted to discuss and go into is, the
different ideas within Islamic pedagogy, within Islamic teaching, particularly when it comes towards the training of younger individuals. What is a teacher? How do you instill many of these concepts? Because I think that'll be an important gateway into the discussion between modern education versus education within the traditional Muslim world, where there are overlaps, where I find there to be flaws within the modern education system, and what can we do as a community to overcome those shortcomings and to, you know, gain a benefit from the ideas found within them.
And just so for the viewers, in 2 weeks, so on July 23rd, mark your calendars, same time, 6 p.m. Central, we will be doing our next episode, episode 3. There will be reminders and flyers that go out. And please, those of you who are watching or watching even later, please leave your comments. We can address a lot of your questions, concerns, even, you know, just comments, you know, about the podcast or where you would like to see us go. Leave them in the comment section, and we will read them. We read through everything. But with that said, we have 3 minutes left. Any concluding thoughts? I mean, I guess for all of us, but I obviously want to start with you, Sayyidullah.
I think we covered the important, you know, concluding thoughts, you know, when it comes to epistemology, science. As I said, you know, a person really needs to be purpose-driven. And that purpose really results from your worldview, your epistemological understanding of what is knowledge. And that translates into every aspect of your life. And I think this is a phenomenon which is all across the modern world and humanity, this lack of purpose and this lack of drive. And it really manifested itself in the worst forms in the pursuit of modern science. I mean, we can see the dangers of some, you know, tools that when a direction is lost, you know, people have been able to produce devices that have killed thousands upon thousands. We've seen bombs created. We've seen, you know, different destructive, you know, elements. We've also seen very positive elements as well, but, you know, you can maximize that good and minimize that, you know, evil by having a purpose. And that's something which really needs to be a reminder. And I think I'll conclude on that. Otherwise, we've discussed many of the other important points related to the subject.
Yeah, thank you. You know, like I said before, epistemology is a very deep topic. There's a lot that can be said. I mean, you know, we're not even scratching the surface.
One last thing, a couple minutes. Is there any books that you recommend if people want to know a little bit more about this topic, to research some more, that you might recommend?
I mean, there's many books on the subject. I mean, to be very honest, most
Just
of my...
more for the casual reader, maybe.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be very honest, most of my reading on the subject has been in the, you know, in the Arabic language. So, you know, sometimes I'm a bit hard-pressed to give recommendations. But I do know that one of the works of Shahid Mutahari was translated on the, I believe it's called The Theory of Knowledge, translated by Mansour Limba. Now, I don't know the quality of the translation, but I mean, he does deal with the discussion on epistemology within there, and, you know, that's what comes to my mind.
Nice. There was 2 topics, at least outside of Islam, that touched upon this that I have read. Well, 2 books. One is called the Tao of Physics, or the Tao of Physics. It's about a theoretical physicist who had some spiritual revelations and then goes down this path of understanding Eastern knowledge, and where this departation of where the West started looking at separating spirituality from science itself. So it's a wonderful book on that topic. I think they also made a documentary on it. And another one is The Unnatural Nature of Science. If you kind of want to understand a little bit about, you can say, things that have polluted the scientific world in modern days a little bit, in terms of what their intention is, as opposed to what intention should be, that kind of thing. It's another good book if anybody's looking for other recommendations.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you, Sayyid Bilal, for all of your insights and joining us today. Thank you to all the viewers who tuned in live, and to all those who are watching later on the recorded. Again, Please leave your comments in the comment section, questions that you have, and we will address them in episode 3 on July 23rd.